everyone. Welcome to Intelligent Talk with Ralph McElveny. Join us every Thursday at 5 p.m. on the City World Radio Network as we discuss topics in politics, art, and current events.
Hello, and welcome to Intelligent Talk. Our website is intelligenttalk.com. We're very pleased to have a very special program today with Miss Julie Summers, who is the author of The Colonel of Tamarkan, Philip Toonsey, and the Bridge on the River Kwai. Her grandfather was the basis for the Alec Guinness character in one of my favorite films, The Bridge on the River Kwai. So I'm very happy to have her on the program. Thank you so much, Miss Summers, for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I just want to get your website. It's Julie Summers, summers.co.uk, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, great. So if I could just start, your grandfather, when did he get into the service, Philip Toonsey? He was at a bank, right? And he was brought in that way?
Yes, so Phil Toonsey was born in 1904, and when he came, he was in Peru briefly in the 1920s, and when he returned, he joined Barings Bank, where he worked for the rest of his life. And the head of Barings Bank in Liverpool was a First World War veteran who insisted that everybody in the bank did some form of military service. So he joined the Territorial Army, the reserves, in 1929 as a lieutenant, and by the outbreak of the Second World War, he'd risen to the rank of major. And he then went out to France at the middle of September 1939, and he spent the Phoney War, which was the war between September and May, in France and Belgium, getting very cold on the Maginot Line. And then, of course, D-Day happened, Dunkirk happened, and he was evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk on the 2nd of June, and then came back to Britain in 1940.
And then he makes his way out to the Far East, right? And he's there when Singapore...
That's right. So what happened was that he asked to be retrained, so they sent him to officer training school, and he then was put in charge of the Norfolk regiment. Norfolk's on the east coast of England, and he was put in charge of this regiment, which was, when he took it over, was pretty feeble, but he got them all sharpened up and well-trained and as crack shots, and they were sent out via America, via Nova Scotia, to the Middle East, in fact, is where they were destined. But on the 7th of December 1941, he was in the captain's cabin when he heard about the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the invasion of Hong Kong and Malaysia, or Malaya as it was in those days. And so the whole convoy was immediately transferred to Singapore, where he arrived on the 29th of January. And he had a fortnight's fighting, 2 weeks fighting on Singapore, and then he got caught.
Yes, Singapore, you mentioned in your book that it was the greatest military defeat that the British had, and I wasn't aware of that until I read your book.
It was supposedly the impregnable fortress of Singapore, and it fell in 2 weeks. It was an absolute disaster, and Churchill was so humiliated by it, because nobody has expected it to fall, but the trouble was that there was no air coverage, so there was no air cover for them, and the Japanese were highly efficient at jungle warfare, and the British had really never come across an enemy like it, and they retreated all the way down the Malayan Peninsula, and he was in fact briefly on the Malaya mainland himself, and then he retreated to Singapore. And what's actually quite interesting, he was awarded a DSO in the field because he was a very brave leader. And 2 days before the surrender, so the surrender took place on the 15th of February 1942, and on the 13th he was called to the headquarters of General Key, who was in charge of the land army on Singapore, and he was ordered to evacuate to India, and he refused.
DSO is a Distinguished Service...
Distinguished Service Order, that's correct, yeah. So he got his Distinguished Service Order. He'd been hauled up in front of General Key and being told he was going to go to India to train another regiment. And he said no. And General Key was very taken aback. But he explained two things. He said, firstly, in the Territorial Army, an order is a matter for discussion. And secondly, he felt very strongly that he could not possibly leave his men. He had 700 men in his regiment, and he did not feel able to leave those men to the mercy of the Japanese captors. So he refused to go, and General Key could do nothing to persuade him, so he stayed and was caught along with 60,000 other Allied soldiers on the 15th of February.
He was kind of like a mini MacArthur then. MacArthur, who did leave the troops, was ordered by FDR to leave, and he left, and of course your grandfather stayed.
He stayed. He was absolutely religious about it.
And the Japanese commander, I think, was the same person who was the Tiger of the Philippines, or Tiger of Malay, General Yamashita, I think was his name.
General Yamashita, he's a very tough man.
Yes, and I remember being in Sentosa, the island next to Singapore, and seeing those guns, and they were all trained out towards the water. They were not really expecting a land attack to the extent that they did. Okay, so
correct, absolutely.
So your grandfather was captured. He's sent to Thailand, and then he is basically assigned to build these famous bridges, which is for the Japanese to move their troops in the anticipated invasion of India through Burma. Now it's called Myanmar, but at that point it was Thailand, obviously. And your grandfather is and he it's two bridges that he built, right? Not just one, like in the movie, correct?
That is correct. So he was initially on Singapore Island for 6 months, and then in October 1942 he was sent up to Singapore with his men and with many other thousands of men, and he was taken to a place called Kanchanaburi, which is a provincial town, and on the outskirts of Kanchanaburi there was a camp which had started to be built, and the key thing about this camp was that it was on the confluence of two rivers, on the River Mekong, which is a huge river coming down from upcountry, and then the River Kwai, which runs up into the jungle, or rather runs down from the jungles, and the confluence happens at Kanchanaburi, and his job was to build a bridge over the River Mekong because it flooded massively in the monsoon season, and so they thought they needed a steel and concrete bridge. So first they built a wooden service bridge, and then after that they built the steel and concrete bridge. And interestingly, the bridges, there are 688 bridges along that track of the Thailand-Burma Railway, which is 415 kilometres, so I don't know, 300 miles long. There are 688 bridges, and all but 9 of them were built of wood, and they were built to an American design, so-called the Merriman design. So it was rather interesting that popped up when I was writing the book.
Did the Japanese steal that design the way they stole from Howard Hughes? Apparently, he helped design the Zero fighter. Apparently, that was Howard Hughes.
That's right.
So I guess that was some American design. So could you just take us to the experience, please, of your grandfather? I mean, I've seen the movie; it's one of my favorite films, of course. But the experience of your grandfather in the camps, and for example, escape. Escape was, unlike the film, it was okay to escape, right? I mean, he knew about some escapes and didn't really help.
So what's really interesting, he was put in charge of a camp, and he was only in charge because he was the most senior British officer. So by the time he was out in Singapore, he was Lieutenant Colonel. In fact, he was an acting Lieutenant Colonel, but he was Lieutenant Colonel Toosey. And so he was put in charge of this camp, and he had 3,500 men, of whom the majority were British and Australian, but he had a small number of Dutch from the East Indies who'd been captured in March 1942. And there were 2 major escape attempts, successful. And the thing is, it was the duty of a British prisoner of war to try and escape. And the Japanese had forced them to sign an agreement to say they would not try. And it was an agreement that was illegal, and it was signed under duress, and Toosey did not believe it. So when 2 of his officers and 5 of his men came to him and said, "We're going to escape," his first reaction is, "I'll come with you." And then the men said, no, you mustn't, sir, you must stay, because the morale of the men will drop if you come with us. And so they escaped, and the men were caught about 3 days later and were taken back to the camp and shot. And then the 2 officers managed to stay away for about a fortnight, 2 weeks, and they eventually were found, and they were brought back to camp. They were interrogated, and then they were bayoneted.
So it wasn't like the Alec Guinness character in the movie where he has these sort of ambivalent about the escapes. He's like, well, we've been ordered to surrender. I'm not even sure we can escape. There wasn't that in actuality then.
No, I mean, it's interesting because years later, a very, very good article came out about him, and he'd never really been able to explain to people what his sort of philosophy was on the railway, but this man really got to the bottom of it, and his philosophy was, we are here as prisoners of the Japanese. I have to do my utmost to look after my men. And so anything he could do to keep them physically safe, to keep them safe from the Japanese, from random beatings, from temper, which there was a lot of, but also to keep them physically fit and to keep their morale up. And he felt that anything he could do to do that would be justified. And so sometimes he did what some people would think would be collaboration, and at other times he was deeply underhand. So on what some people might construe as collaboration, he worked with the Japanese command, and he said, I will let my men work for you, including the officers, on the condition that you give us one rest day in every 10 days, you allow my men to have a canteen, which would help supplement their diet, because they did get paid a pittance, but they could buy eggs and peanut butter. But the third thing, crucially, was that all the orders for the men would be given in English and not Japanese. And that was a major concession, because it meant that he could ask his regimental sergeant majors, for example, to hand out the tools the night before work parties took place. So basically he gave the men a very clear structure. And of course it helped massively. And in his camp, the death rate on the bridge building camp was 9 men out of 3,500.
That's amazing, yeah. And so that is another difference from the film, too. There wasn't this struggle with the officers, because as you know, a big part of the film is it's Alec Guinness, Colonel Nicholson, not working, because it says the Geneva Code doesn't allow officers to work, and that wasn't the case.
That did happen in other camps. That's interesting. There were other camps where the British officers took a stand and said, officers shall not work.
Okay.
And Toosey, when he heard that the Japanese were going to order the officers to work, he went to see, he called all his officers together, and he said, this is the position. The Japanese are going to order you to work. You can make up your mind whether you're going to work and therefore better protect your men, or whether you're going to refuse, in which case I will refuse with you and we will get shot. And I will get shot with you. So he was absolutely unafraid, and he put it to the officers, and in the end, they all unanimously agreed that their duty was to their men rather than sticking to the code of the law. But at the next door camp, at Chung Kai, the officers did take a stand, and they were threatened on the parade ground by the Japanese, who drove up with machine guns, as you saw in the film, but nobody was shot, thank goodness.
And one of the interesting...
They had to give in the end.
Yes. One of the interesting things from your book as well, which I did not know, is that it was mostly Korean guards. You hear about the Korean women as comfort women used by the Japanese, essentially forced into prostitution. You hear about the Ukrainian guards, which guarded like Sobibor, the German death camps for the Germans. It was, I think, like Sobibor had almost all Ukrainian guards. Then the SS were essentially officers. But I did not know that there were the Korean guards. Essentially, were they in the majority of the camp?
Yes, they were. So what the position was that the Japanese had been sitting on Korea for 30 plus years, and they had very little opinion of the Koreans. They regarded them as sort of not real people. It's very shocking, actually. They were deeply racist towards them, and so they got the Koreans to do their dirty work. If you think about it, the Japanese ended up with 130,000 prisoners of war in prison camps all over Southeast Asia, and you're not going to put your best men best soldiers onto guarding these camps, because basically prisoners were regarded as men who were defeated and had given up and were to be despised. So they used the Koreans, who they had no opinion of, to guard the camps. And the Koreans were vicious, because it meant that they felt they had a power over people for the first time, and they'd been very badly treated by the Japanese, so they meted out that treatment to the British and the Australians and the Americans who were in the camps. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why the prisoners had such a bad time, was because they were the sort of kicking boy for the Koreans.
That's very interesting, because also in Sobibor, the Ukrainian guards were in many cases more brutal than the Germans, so it was the same type of deal. Yeah. They had to look down upon other people. One of the commander of in the film is named Saito, Colonel Saito, and also the commander of this camp is named Saito as well, correct, in real life?
That is one of those extraordinary coincidences. But in the film, he's a colonel. In real life, he was a regimental sergeant major he'd been in a cavalry regiment, and I've actually got a photograph of him on his horse. So he was a proper soldier. He was the only proper soldier from the Imperial Japanese Army that my grandfather came in touch with. And they actually worked together quite successfully. And when the escape happened, that we talked about briefly, Saito went to Toosey and said, "Did you know these men were going to escape?" And Saito said yes. And he said, "Who else knew?" And he said, "It was only me. I'm the only person who knew. The only person they were told who told me." And Saito then punished him. He gave him a big beating, and then he made him stand outside in the sun for 24 hours with his hands above his head, which was a typical Japanese punishment. But Toosey completely understood that. He'd caused Saito to lose face. But he also knew that because Saito had punished him in such an ostensibly humiliating way, that would get him off being interrogated by the Kempeitai, who were the Gestapo of the Japanese army. So Saito was protecting Toosey, and they ended up by having quite a good informal agreement where Saito would give him concessions. For example, he allows him to have the canteens, as we know. He helped him have the Yazumi days, the rest days. And anything Saito could do to make the camp function better, he did, because he knew that Toosey would go along with him and comply with any of his wishes. So it was a very good relationship. And at the end of the war, I mean, they weren't friends, they were still enemies, but it was a good relationship that worked. And at the end of the war, Saito was to be screened for war crimes, and my grandfather was in charge of the screening. And when Saito's name came up, he said, let him go.
Yes, and he actually visited your grandfather's grave, didn't he? He became a Catholic.
Yeah, so he then came back from... he went straight back to Japan. He converted to Christianity, which is quite unusual. And he wanted to come and see my grandfather, and he didn't see him while he was still alive, but he visited his grave on the 12th of August 1984, which would have been the old man's 80th birthday. And he wrote an incredibly moving letter to my uncle afterwards, saying that he could die happy because he'd fulfilled his last duty, which was to pay his respects to the man who had changed the philosophy of his life.
Could you just tell me approximately what the dates were that he was under the control of Saito, your grandfather? How long?
My grandfather was under the control of Saito from the 21st of October 1942 until the 1st of May 1943.
Okay.
And then he was moved to a different camp. And Saito crops up again in his life in 1944, but he wasn't in charge then. He was just second in command, so he didn't have any relationship with my grandfather the second time around.
And what also is interesting in your book, so you said, I can't remember if this is a book or in a speech you gave, because I saw some speeches you gave as well. You said the Japanese in the film were most annoyed by their engineering portrayal as being incompetent engineers, not by being cruel, but just being portrayed as incompetent. Could you just discuss that?
Yes,
I mean, they were competent engineers, I guess, right? They were
enormously competent engineers, and there are photographs taken by the Germans of the Japanese engineers surveying the railway trace in 1937. So the Japanese had already planned to build this railway. Ideas for the railway had existed in the 1890s, but the Brits had concluded that the loss of life would be so high on using local labour, that it was too much of it was an engineering project too far. But the Japanese didn't have any qualms about using slaves as engineers, and so they had this huge bag of unwilling but nevertheless relatively fit young men who became ill very quickly. So they were good engineers, and they planned the railway, and it was built in sections, and the sections all met up. So the engineering drawings was extraordinarily successful. And although the men built the railway, they didn't, unlike the film, they didn't have anything to do with the design. It was the 5th and the 9th Imperial Japanese engineering units that actually oversaw the construction of the railway, and the Brits and the Australians and the Kiwis and the Americans, they were all just slaves. They were literally used as slaves.
How close did the Japanese get to seriously being able to invade India? Was it like Hitler with the invasion of England, that they sort of talked about it, they made plans, but it wasn't really something they could seriously do? They didn't have the manpower?
I think they were too stretched. I think that was the problem. I think it was the same issue as the Germans had in Russia. They had underestimated the complexities of invading India, and their line going up through the railway, it just was not efficient enough. The railway was bombed heavily by the British and the Americans from 1943 onwards. And what's interesting is that initially it would take 24 hours to get from Bangkok to Moulmein, and by the time the war was coming to an end, and by the time the planned invasion was going to take place, it was taking 5 days. So their supply line was just too fragile.
All right. You told a great story about the famous scene at the end where the bridge is, of course, blown up, which didn't happen in real life, but adds a wonderful element to the movie. And I'd like you to tell that story. Before you do, I just want to mention Sam Spiegel produced the film. David Lean directed. David Lean went on to go to do Lawrence of Arabia. Sam Spiegel is someone who I admire a lot with the quality of the films that he did. I think the old Hollywood, he admired the British a lot. I think his adage was, or the adage at that time, think Yiddish and dress British. In terms of that was because as many of the Hollywood people did, they admired them. But could you mention that last scene, please, with some of the problems they had? And
I absolutely will. So the film was not filmed in Thailand at all, because when the art director went to have a look at Thailand, he found it flat, boring, and there was a bridge there already. So they chose Singapore. They chose Sri Lanka to film, and they went to a place about 3 hours from Colombo called Kitulgala, where there was a beautiful river with white rapids. And they built the bridge. It was constructed, in fact, they did build 2 bridges there too. So this great wooden bridge was created for the film. And Sam Spiegel was an enormously flamboyant character, as you've just illustrated. And so when he came to the scene where they were going to bring the train over the bridge and blow it up, he invited many dignitaries and people who supported the film from Colombo, and they had a grand feast, and there was a sort of tables laid out and umbrellas, and the scene was set. And Don Ashton, the art director, and David Lean were standing ready to film. Don Ashton had a board with 5 light bulbs on it, and there were 5 cameramen who were going to watch the bridge explode. But because it was really dangerous, what they were going to do was they were going to set the cameras running on David Lean's command and then switch a switch that would cause a light to light up on the board. And so Don Ashton could be certain that his 5 cameramen were safe. So David Lean gives the command, the train in the background, pouring with smoke, it's all very tense and exciting, and the first cameraman who's on the train jumps off, presses his light bulb comes on. 2nd, 3rd, 4th, the 5th cameraman, a man called Freddie Ford, turned on his camera, jumped away, but he forgot to light his light. And so Don Ashton and David Lean had to make a split-second decision. Did they blow the bridge up and risk killing Freddie Ford, or did they allow the train to rumble on? And they decided to stay their hand. So the train went tearing over the bridge and crashed into some sandbanks beyond the bridge. And it was a complete non-event, so all the dignitaries had to go back to Kitulgala. And 3 days later, they managed to haul the train back, and then it took place, the great explosion took place dramatically. The most expensive explosion in movie history to date was $56,000 worth of explosives. That took place in front of a few locals.
And Sam Spiegel, I think he exaggerated, said it was $250,000, right?
He did. He was very, again, he was hugely enthusiastic about the whole project. He told people that in the publicity leading up to the film, it had been a $250,000 scene, explosion, great drama. But in fact, I found the accounts. I'm a great sniffer outer of detail, and I found the accounts when I was looking through David Lean's papers, and there it was, $56,000. That's still a lot of money in 1957.
Yes, that's if I could just take you a little bit to after the war ends, Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan, is made a Knight of the Garter. You mentioned, and that was a little bit controversial in England. What was your grandfather's position on that?
So this is interesting because actually he was remade a Knight of the Garter. He'd been a Knight of the Garter prior to the war. He was stripped of it during the war, and the decision was taken in the 1970s late 1960s to reinstate him. And he felt that the Queen had been put into a very difficult position, and he felt very sorry for her, but he respected the diplomacy behind it. And so when the prisoners told him they were going to object when Hirohito came to London, he ordered them not to object. He ordered them to behave in a seemly way and not to demonstrate against Hirohito. And it was quite controversial. Not all the prisoners were happy with him, but he had terrific personality, and he was very frail. He had had major heart surgery, and Peter Davis, who wrote an early biography of him, told me that he went into the hall and he saw this frail old man standing up, aged 72 and nearly dying, in front of 3,500 men, and he ordered them in a very calm but very firm voice not to disgrace him and not to disgrace the Queen. And he said it was quite extraordinary. The entire hall was absolutely silent. Nobody murmured. And when he left the stage, because many knew it was the last time they'd ever see him alive, they threw their hats in the air and their walking sticks, they cheered and clapped. It was quite extraordinary. But Peter said he knew that Toosey had such command over his men that they would listen to him. And they did. And so they did not demonstrate. Some of the men turned their backs when Hirohito was driven down towards Buckingham Palace, but nobody demonstrated.
As you know, after the war, MacArthur, who was the American commander in Japan after the war, made the decision to basically cover up a lot of his role in war crimes because the Americans felt we needed Hirohito to control Japan, and we were concerned about the Soviets, etc. But his brother was in charge of Unit 731, which was doing terrible experiments on behalf of the Japanese in China, nerve agents, almost like an Auschwitz type thing. I don't know how much of that was known by your grandfather at the time or when Hirohito was made a Knight of the Garter.
I know how much he knew about that, to be perfectly honest. He wasn't a particularly political man, and I don't think he was senior enough. I think that would have been known at brigadier and above level. Remember, he was only a field officer. He wasn't a staff officer. I do know that he was the representative of the prisoners of war when the Japanese decided to pay war reparations to the prisoners, and he was told to go and meet the Japanese ambassador, and he found that very uncomfortable. It was the first time he'd met officially a Japanese since the war, and that did trouble him. But he was very private about it. He never spoke about why it troubled him, other than the obvious reason that it brought back some very unpleasant memories.
Yes.
But all he really cared about all his life were the men. That was his prime concern from the day he arrived at Singapore after the defeat to the day he died. He was still getting 100 letters a week from prisoners in the 1960s.
Really? And when did your grandfather pass away? 70s?
He died on 23rd of December 1975. So he was 71.
Did you know him fairly well yourself?
Yeah, I did. Well, somebody was asking me this the other day. I did know him, but I knew him as a granddaughter, you see. Right. I was born in 1960, so I was 15 when he died. But he was ill from about 1969 onwards. So my memory of him is as a very frail old man with the most brilliant repertoire of whistles. He was very funny and full of humour, full of joie de vivre, even when he was dying. And as children, we absolutely loved him. And the only time I ever remember being frightened of him was when my sister and I, we must have been about 7 and 9, were staying with him and my grandmother. And my grandfather was cooking mince for the dogs in the back kitchen. They had 2 kitchens, one little back kitchen where he kept his boots and his shotguns and everything. He was a great shooter, and he was boiling up this mince, and my sister walked into the kitchen. She turned up her little nose and she said, "That's disgusting. What is it?" And he said, "It's mince for my dogs." And she said, "I'd rather die than eat that." And he turned around on her. She was only tiny. Turned around and he went, "Never, ever let me hear you say something like that again in my life. Where I was, that would have been a feast for my men." And he walked out and he slammed the door, and she burst into floods of tears because she was terrified. And I remember standing there thinking, gracious Grandpa Bush, that's horrific. And then he came back in and was apologetic and scooped her up and petted her. But she just had triggered something that was so fundamental in him.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. We touched on this briefly via email, but I think I mentioned to you that my grandfather served in both the Pacific and the Atlantic Theater, and you were saying
you did, yes.
And you were saying that the Pacific Theater was more brutal, had more of an impact, of course, and you had definitive studies showing that, like the impact of people serving in Asia was much greater. Is that fair to say? Then
I think it's absolutely fair to say, and I think there's several reasons for it. In terms of the prisoners of war, it was because they were unable to communicate with their families. There was barely any correspondence, whereas people who were in Germany and Africa and fighting on the European front, they had letters. So I think there was a sense they were completely cut off. They got no assistance from the Red Cross, except towards the very end. And that, I think, they really suffered, so they didn't have medicines. And I think in terms of the fighting, for the men who fought in India and particularly near Rangoon in Burma, they found the foe a very different foe from what they were used to on the European front. The Japanese were extraordinarily brave and tenacious, but they were used to fighting in hand-to-hand combat, and I think that was quite shocking. And I think other people who fought in other theatres of the Asian War, they found they weren't fighting an enemy like they had done in the First World War, a familiar enemy.
And did your grandfather like the film? Did he enjoy it when he saw it?
When he went to see it, he took my mum. She was about 20, I suppose, and he thought it was a very good film. He thought it was amusing and entertaining and great. And then about a month or so later, there was a big meeting of the prisoners of war, and they'd all seen it as well, and they were absolutely horrified because they said, "But sir, it's a terrible slur on your leadership, don't you understand?" And after that, he became not obsessed about the film, but he became obsessed about the idea that people would believe that the bridge on the River Kwai was true history, whereas it wasn't. And he became very concerned about that right up to the end of his life. But he didn't dislike the film as such. He admired David Lean very much.
What did he think was the most worrisome part about a fantasy movie versus the reality? Just what most troubled him?
Well, there's sort of the whole heroic side of the sort of, of the blowing up of the bridge worried him. I think two things. He didn't like the portrayal of the collaborative aspect. He didn't like the fact that they were portrayed as being better engineers than the Japanese, because he found that was completely false. He obviously didn't approve of the whole scenes with the women, because he said the only Thai women he ever saw were ones who got red teeth because they've been eating beetle nuts. So he felt that was wrong. But he pointed out in an interview that, of course, had they made a film based on the true story, it would have been very grim, because for a lot of the time they were starving, hungry, and miserable and disease-ridden. And you can't make a very entertaining film about people who are suffering from dysentery. So he was aware that Hollywood had produced the entertainment, but as I said, he really wasn't comfortable with the sort of glorification of the whole construction of the bridge.
And Saito was actually a fairly humane commander, wasn't he, compared to some of the others on that railroad line?
Oh my goodness, yes. So there were one or two absolute horrors. The particular one was a man called Noguchi, who was in the last camp, and my grandfather thought he probably had syphilis. He was incredibly vicious and aggressive, and was meted out totally arbitrary punishments which nobody could see coming. So on one occasion he called my grandfather's translator in, because the translator had told one of the Korean guards not to beat another prisoner, and he said to the Korean guard, just watch this, because there'll be retribution after the war. This was May 1945, and the Korean guard was very cross. So he went to Noguchi, and Noguchi tore a strip off this translator, Bill Drower, and because he was very tall, Bill Drower, he was 6'3", and Noguchi was small. When Noguchi went to hit him hard, which he did, Bill slipped and fell, and he broke Noguchi's desk. And Noguchi was so angry that the Emperor of Japan had been insulted by this man falling on his desk, that he stuck him in a hole in the ground. And Bill Drower was in a hole in the ground for 77 days.
Wow. Is that Noguchi the same spelling as the famous designer in America?
Yes, it is. No relation, I believe.
No relation.
Noguchi, yes. Wow. But Noguchi was a really nasty piece of work. Yeah.
Well, could I? Well, just before we conclude, it's been a very interesting discussion. Are you working on anything now that you can tell us about? Or I know you were in New York recently.
I have been in New York recently. I can indeed. I'm writing another biography, my first biography of a woman. And this woman was the wartime editor of British Vogue. And the reason I was in New York was to read the files on British Vogue in the Condé Nast archives in Broadway. And I have had the most exciting time there, because we found documents that I didn't believe still existed. So it was a very, very thrilling visit. And I shall be writing that biography. I've done 18 months research, so I'll be writing the biography over the next 10 months. And it hopefully will come out in 2020.
Well, that's wonderful. And your website, again, is Julie Summers, SUMMERS.co.uk. And thank you so much for coming on the program. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thursday, May 15th, Holy Apostle Soup Kitchen, New York's largest emergency food program, is hosting From Farm to Tray, a sustainable